Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and the floor is yours, John. Best of luck.
Thank you. It's very weird because I can see nobody up here with all the lights, so hopefully you can hear me. So my name's John Allen. I'm hopefully going to get technology right. I am, right. I'm from the UK. I'm a strategic consultant for Radiflow, and I'm here today to talk about driving excellence in OT cybersecurity as your organization moves into a digital world. So hopefully I'll give you a little bit of context about the sort of change over time in digital and talk about the challenges in running a digital and cyber program alongside each other. Just a little bit about me. I worked previously at GlaxoSmithKline for 23 years, which is a global pharmaceutical company, and that produces things like vaccines, prescription medication, and over-the-counter things like creams and stuff. In that time, I was there from infrastructure through to architecture, mergers and acquisitions, application services, and the last half of my career was in manufacturing IT, where I finished up as a VP running the OT cybersecurity program. The interesting challenge in that particular program in GSK is it had been running for a while, so they'd been trying to address their OT cybersecurity transformation, and I had a great team of probably quite expensive and very capable cybersecurity consultants, but they were trying to push a program from the center of the organization. So in summary, I was brought in reporting to the CISO of the company as the OT CISO to work out how I could transform this program. And fundamentally, the transformation about the program was really moving from a common failure mode in many programs where we put a OT cybersecurity change program in the center under CISO or IT, and then we tell our lovely engineering team and shop floor team, you've got to do this because you won't get a green tick in the box. It doesn't work very well. The business are very focused on running machines, shop floor, and so on. So that was the introduction I was put into the program for, and it was simply because I'd worked with the senior leaders across the engineering and shop floor environment for quite a few years. So the first thing we did in that program was we recognized that we needed to get the right people into a discussion and reset the program. So we ran a strategy workshop with the engineering leaders, the supply chain leaders, the CISO team, the IT team, and said, well, what are we really trying to achieve here? How are we going to address this particular challenge? And in that journey, we took a first step of understanding the challenge in business language, and that was simply, firstly, to be able to see and know what we had out there. So as a large pharmaceutical with 77 manufacturing sites around the world, R&D and laboratory centers, they didn't actually know what was out in their OT environment. So we undertook a risk assessment, and in hindsight, it was quite a hard way to do it, and we'll talk a bit more about it later on. And we went out and we created this humongous spreadsheet, and we sent it around the world and said, right, guys in engineering, go and fill this spreadsheet out. Write down all the assets you've got and answer some questions. And the answers to those questions will give us a vulnerability position for your particular asset. That was useful. I think we were a bit shocked when we discovered 45,000 OT assets, which is probably about half of what was there if we had looked a bit deeper. But what the value was there was we were able to then roll up that information and go back to effectively the top of the house in the company and say, we've looked across these sites around the world, we found 45,000 systems out there, and these particular group here have got a high risk of a cyber event, and that equates to $4 billion of revenue impact on one particular factory. That's a game changer. So we started talking, instead of about CVEs and risk, we started talking about supply chain continuity factors. So that was a big step for the company in in really moving from a central program to a business-aligned program where we shared the accountability. We then went further, and as we went for the program, we basically had the usual sort of steering committees. But again, the difference there was it wasn't the central group sitting there saying, hey, look what a great job we're doing. It was the business coming to the table saying, we've got a supply chain continuity risk. You're helping us with this. This is where we've got to. This is what extra help we need. So part of that risk exercise, and I'll talk about this in a bit, was to create a solutions framework that talked about here are the risks and here are the solutions, and this is the impact they can have on your risk posture. And that came with investment opportunities. So just a little story before I get into the main content. I worked with a company called Merck. I say I worked with them. I was on the tail end of their cyber attack. So for those that don't know, in 2017 there was an event within Merck, large pharmaceutical again, where a company, it's actually a Russian organization, had infiltrated a Ukrainian organization, which was a financial software provider, and planted a NotPetya malware into that software. And that software in turn then replicated itself down to the customer. So effectively it was a software update, it went out, it sat idle for a while, and then it was activated. And unfortunately for Merck at the time, they had a privileged access account logged onto that server. It took advantage of that, and within 15 minutes, pretty much the whole of the manufacturing capability for Merck ceased functioning. That in turn effectively encrypted the data on 40,000 PCs and servers so that it wasn't recoverable. Merck spent a long time recovering it. They had product outages. I couldn't get a Hep B vaccination, as an example. And then at the end of that journey, it was a $1.4 billion settlement, which was argued at the time as an act of war, and today that could have changed. So a little bit about me, a little bit about some of the sort of real-life stories out there in the world as a consequence of actually digital and cyber journeys. Sorry, I'm just going to need a drink because I'm drying up. So I'm briefly going to touch on the journey of the evolution of technology leading to the fourth industrial revolution. And I apologize if it's all news that you guys know, but I just think it's worth putting it into context. So back in the 80s, I used to be a shift operator at a company called British Aerospace that made many things, including weapons and aircraft and stuff like that. And this picture on the left here is a Univac 9400 mainframe, for those that remember mainframes. It had lovely flashing lights on it, and its memory capacity was 262K, and those disk drives on the left that look like washing machines held 29 megabytes of data. At that time, the way the world worked was you had a mainframe processor, you fed it with, in this case, you can see the punch cards, and that was its data input, and it spewed out a load of printed reports, and that might be in your general ledger or your payroll report. As time moved on, the green screen came along, and then the PC screen came along. But the key thing here was at that point in those days, it was one central data repository, fairly simple to maintain and less vulnerable, but was it? And I'll come back to that. Then in the 90s, the client server came along where we had potentially servers connected back to mainframes and users of PCs getting a richer environment to interact with the server-based thing. So we started seeing distributed data. And then today we get to our integrated ecosystem of IoT where we've got data everywhere, wearables, sensors, IIoT, you name it. It's been a big change. The drivers for that have been really around regulators. They want to see more data. We want better performance, better quality, and want to be a modern employer and keep up with the competition. And finally, you get the data, digital, and analytics win of having so much data available that you can improve your performance and so on. Now, you think about the changes there. You might say a lot's changed. Well, it kind of has, but back in the 1980s, again, I was working 4 o'clock in the morning. IBM engineer turns up at site and he's got a circuit board under his arm. So I said to him, "Why are you here?" And his answer was, "I've been dialed into your mainframe and I've identified a critical fault on your circuit board." So really, in terms of connectivity, it's changed, but even back in the 80s, you could still connect to a computer and potentially do damage. So the changes have really been around geopolitical, malicious intent and exploitation intent, and basic technologies moved on so people can do that. So as the world becomes more connected, we realize the value of technology and data. Protecting these assets becomes a key success factor for us. So moving into a little bit around the challenges of a cyber program for a company. What we find is you've got the digital promise on the left here, which I've said in previous slides, so I won't repeat. And actually, if you get it right and you've got a cyber fit environment, you get some big wins around data connectivity and so on. But if you think about an example where, and this is quite important as to how you position the digital discussion over a cyber discussion. But if you think about an example of you bought an old car, your friend comes along and says, "Hey, I've got this super digital engine, you're going to put it in your car and you're going to win all the races." And you're like, "Well, I really like that." So you put this engine in your car, get on the racetrack, down the first lane, and you're a big pile of metal at the end of that lane. And the reason for that is as you've built that car, you've not thought about the foundations that are required to underpin that digital solution. And that, in that case, could be things like tyres, suspension, brakes, and so on. So then you start thinking about that in digital context. When somebody comes into your company, and hopefully they have, and hopefully you've gone a long way in it, and you get the promise of digital, the discussion is all about productivity and saving. What people don't generally talk about is what I call the cyber debt, which is basically if you're going digital and you're not investing in the foundations that underpin it, you're going to be that car at the end of the racetrack in a few years' time. So I think it's really important in a digital agenda that you start embedding your foundations. Now, these are just some examples of foundations. I'll talk a bit more about these in a while. But so you've gone down to digital, you're starting to look at cyber. You need to start thinking about your operating model. So this is all about people, process, and technology. So you're looking at your operating model and think, well, once we've implemented our digital journey or our cyber journey, what's going to be different? What are the accountabilities of an engineer? How are they going to change? What process do we need to modify? What standards do we need to modify? And where are the accountabilities? Then the usual things around digital data security and resilience by design have to be factored in as you grow your plant, and ultimately culture, skills, and mindset. So a good example of this is a lot of companies, I'm sure you all do it, you get an email in your inbox and it's a phishing email. Many people get those, and it turns up and you click the button and then your security team come along and they tell you off because you've been caught by a phishing email. So that's all kind of good stuff. But when you think about that in a shop floor context, how do you help your business, the person that's operating a machine or engineering a machine, actually understand what it means? Now, the reason this is important is there's something along the lines of 60% of your malicious malware comes in through people. So if you start educating your people, and in the example I was talking about, we went out to sites, and we talked to sites about what does cyber mean for you at home and what does it mean in your workplace. And then we went further, and I guess USB sticks is a topic we could talk about for ages, but we basically said, right, if an engineer comes on site with a USB stick, they go through what I call the board of control, and we put security booths in place so that as an engineer came in, their USB stick would get scanned and given a certificate of cleanliness. So first message here is thinking about what underpins your journey and the foundations. Second message is life cycle in context. So many people are probably familiar with different life cycle diagrams. This is just one of them. So if I said to the audience, has anybody bought a new piece of plant machinery in the last 6 months? I'm guessing a few people would say, yes, they have. And then you start thinking about when you bought that machinery, did you ask the vendor through your procurement process what standards they adopt for cybersecurity? How often do they patch? How quickly do they patch? And so on. And that goes right for the life cycle. So thinking about your life cycle is important. Then the next thing is what I like to call IT, no speaky OT. And this was quite a common problem. I've seen it in many industries, not just where I came from, where you've got your IT guys, they're generally quite centrally minded. They're very excited by keeping things patched every week. They like the structure, they like the technology. They don't really understand the business and their process, but they understand they need to support them. And they get very excited about digital, agile, and sometimes a bit concerned about, I'll put GXP on here, by that I mean regulations. Now, the manufacturing person, you walk into a site and you say to them, what do you care about? Well, the first thing they care about is always safety first, I hope it is. And that's usually safety around a person or an impact on the environment in some industries. Then they'll get into things like their quality, including the regulations, the productivity, as in their OE on their machines, cost of goods, real-time processing, and they've got machines that have been out there 20 years that probably cost millions of pounds that they need to keep alive. So the challenge here is, and it really goes back to the earlier comment about finding the right language with your business to help them understand how it relates to them. So in this particular example here, we did things like we first of all went out to the sites and we talked to them about what it meant. And then we started introducing the word cyber safety into the organisation. Sounds really trivial, but when you talk to an engineer about safety and you put cyber safety in there, they can start thinking about how they embed it into their processes as well. So digital brings big value. Robust foundations in cybersecurity skills, processes, and technology must be factored into your business case. If anyone's doing a business case with digital transformation without including the cyber debt, it's not a valid business case. So quickly in terms of, I'm just watching the time, I've got 8 minutes left, okay. In terms of your flow, so if you're thinking about starting a program up, this is really just a potential flow you could use. And the first thing I say about any cyber program is if anyone comes in and tells you it's all about technology, they've missed an awful lot, which is a lot of it is about people and process. So it's partly about what technology you implement to protect and manage your environment, but it's also about what you need to change in terms of people, capabilities, and the processes. And I'll talk about operating models and things in a minute. So in terms of a good flow to think about for a program, having a good trigger is always a great one. And sometimes those triggers a company might be quite sensitive to risk and they want to do something. Sometimes it might be a competitor like Merck, in the example I used, had an event, or sometimes, unfortunately, it might be an internal event. So getting value out of a crisis is also a good thing here to get going. And the next thing is having a compelling business case. And a compelling business case isn't talking CVE language and stuff like that. It's talking about business KPIs and the impact they can have. So really, when you get that to the top of the house, bringing it to life in terms of value and potential impact. Third thing is a business partner. So if you're trying to do this from the centre and you've not got a business partner that works in the environment, you're probably going to fail, because fundamentally the ideal position to get to in a cyber program is to move from a push to a pull model where your business understand the problem and they're starting to pull the solutions, and you need a good business partner. That can then be underpinned by a framework of solutions. So these are solutions that can help reduce your risk that they can pull on, and then seeing what you've got out there in your asset discovery, knowing what vulnerabilities you've got is really key. That can then lead to a joint strategy that you then take to the top of the house, to your C-level, to get approval. And then you're starting to think about what service partners do I need to help me do the heavy lifting, like network segmentation, and in future state operating model. When I've done all this and I've spent all this money, what's going to be different in my people, process, and my skills? I'm on to my last slide now. So this is a framework. Somebody asked me which standard does it belong to, and the answer is I don't know. It's just the framework that I used on the program I worked in. And so these are the types of things you're thinking about. And I'll talk about the generic ones and come back to the starting points. But basically, if you look at this, you've got things like network segmentation, which is probably obvious to everybody. But then there's challenges in network segmentation, which is, do you segment at regional level, at site level, or do you go right down to zones and conduits and segment at almost a production line level? As an example for that, you might have a production line that's producing, for example, a vaccine, and when that vaccine's been incubated, it's worth millions of pounds. When that vaccine comes out of that VAT process, it then goes into a just pack and dispense process, and there's probably hundreds of thousands of pounds at a time going in there. So when that production line is all in the same network, you kind of, well, it's the same product, but actually a small impact could take out a VAT and spoil millions of pounds worth of product. So things like that need to be factored in your design. Talk about IDAMs, quite an obvious one, but I think it's something like 80% of cyber events can be root caused back to IDAM. So it's pretty important that you protect your identity and access management, and obvious things like think about your privileged access accounts, how many of those do you have, and actually how do you control them? So do you have privileged access accounts all around a company with no controls on them, or do you have privileged access accounts that you can technically lock away into a vault that then get checked out when they're used? So controls like that are really important in terms of reducing the risk. Critical patching, everybody talks about it. IT guys love doing it. OT environment, can you get a patch? Do the vendors produce them? How quickly do they respond? And then how quickly can you install them? A lot of effort and time will go into patching. I'll talk about the blue ones in a minute. So operating model I've touched on, but as you go through a program of work, when do you implement an operating model? So as an example, some companies might say, like my guys in IT are now going to take on more accountability in OT. Some companies might say, no, they're not touching our systems. We don't want our SCADAs or our PLCs under IT's control. But even so, you've then got to start thinking about that life cycle that you apply. Well, if you're going to stay as you are, which is fine, what do the engineering guys take on additional accountabilities for in maintaining the security hygiene of that environment? And then you add in things like your processes, what needs to change there, and your standards and what people capabilities. And people capabilities is a really tough one in terms of getting hold of them. Then moving on again to the next one, I'm going to come back to the other. I've got 3 minutes left. So focus on critical supply chains, third parties, obvious things. So you're thinking about your engineers coming on site, then you need to start thinking about your vendors that are dialed in, and then ultimately start thinking about your external partners that are doing things like supply chain and manufacturing for you, and make sure they've got some level of good cyber hygiene in place. So just to quickly finish up then, the starting points for me, if somebody says to me, where do you start? The first thing I say to people is, we'll start with your business continuity plan, because that will tell you a lot of what's critical in your business, and you can start distilling focus areas. The second thing I say about business continuity plans is try and do a test. So we did one in the company I was in, and the scenario was all the SCADA control systems have been taken out by a ransom attack. What are you going to do? And the answer from the business was, we're going to evacuate the site, safety first. We've got all these explosive fluids flying around. But it really brings it to life for the business by using BCPs and testing. And then the next thing I was going to talk about is a little bit around the inventory and vulnerability management and so on. So as I said in the GSK example, we took a manual risk framework. We ended up with 25 people managing the framework and the processes, and that's quite extensive. So we also had the challenge of how accurate it was and how up to date it was. So being able to see and know what you've got is a really key, important step. And I would say to people, if you can get tooling that will give it to you, then great. If that tooling can go a stage further and tell you where you need to start focusing, even better. At the end of the day, once you've got that monitoring, that inventory and asset management in place, you're then moving into your monitoring, where you've got feeds into your SOC and SIEM and so on. And then finally, to finish on, the last thing I've sort of touched on before is get going on your culture and awareness. So even if you're sitting down thinking, I'm going to spend a load of money doing network segmentation, but actually starting to think about, well, actually, if I get some awareness out of that, that's a 60% potential risk reduction just through staff understanding the challenges of cyber and what they can do to stop it coming into the company. And I think that's me finished, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.